All right, what explains the growth of slavery in 19th century United States? Number one factor would probably have to be the cotton boom. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which created a huge demand for cotton across the world. America went from producing 150,000 bales in 1815 to 4 million bales by 1860. And as cotton production grew, slavery and the slave population grew as well. Slaves were needed to work the plantations and cotton farms. In 1790, America had around 700,000 slaves. 1830, 2 million. In 1860, around the peak of the cotton boom, there were 4 million slaves in America, half of which worked on cotton plantations or farms in the United States. The 19th century also saw the slave codes enforced. Slaves went from being, in the 17th century, indentured servants that, worked for a period of time and then gained their freedom to lifelong service. The slave codes in the 19th century also put laws in place to oppress African slaves even more. They were, restrictions on gathering, meeting of 3 or more slaves, for example. It was against the law for a white person to educate a slave, teach them to read or write. These were just laws which were just forms of oppression, just trying to keep the slaves from uprising, changing their circumstances, fighting back and abolishing slavery. And these laws and power were controlled by the white planter class. These planters had more than 20 slaves, but some had as many as 1,000 slaves. It's hard to even imagine, but you were considered a planter if you had 20 or more slaves. And these planters controlled the political, economic, and social events of the American South, and they were not going to outlaw slavery or abolish it because it was their means of wealth. They were getting rich off the slave labor of the African Americans. And then 25% of the American South owned slave, 1 in 4. So even the poor whites and the yeoman farmers that did not have slaves, they still supported it because they were under this false notion of white superiority, where they felt that if the African American slaves were freed, that they would drive down their labor wages, or they would consider themselves equal to them, which they did not want. And I think when the expansion into the western front in the Black Belt, which where these cotton farms were at in western Georgia and the Carolinas all the way out to Texas, as the farmers moved out there, they needed slaves to work these cotton plantations and farms. And you saw the populations grow in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama from 300,000, which over 250,000 were in Georgia, to over 1.6 million. Of this 1.6 million in population growth, 40% were slaves. So a big part of the population growth in the American South was out of slave labor and slavery. And with this, it became big business. The African slave trade had been outlawed in 1808, so you could no longer import slaves from Africa. So this made the value of the American slaves in America grow up tremendously. The value of all the slaves in America in 1860 was more than the railroads, factories, and banks combined. So that just to go to show you the money invested in slavery and slaves, and it became a horrific American institution, especially in the American South. And I think that's why it was able to grow in the 19th century and became a horrible blemish on American history, and something that will surely never be forgotten and hopefully never repeated. But the combination of factors, mainly cotton, the need for slaves on the cotton plantations, the implementation of these slave codes, the value of the slaves themselves becoming big business, with the slave markets popping up in Virginia and the Carolinas because they had exhausted their soil by overplanting their tobacco and cotton. So now they were making money from selling the slaves themselves. So the slave markets became big business, and it was, the economy and the white planter class controlling everything that really led to the growth of slavery in the 19th century. Thank you.